G'day, everybody. How you doing there? My name is Hendo, and today we're going to have a little bit of a chat about data in the brewery or measurements in the brewery and why they're so important to get right and to have some trust issues, which is probably confusing a few people. But let's just dive in and take a look. So I'll just bring up my PowerPoint here. And while I'm pulling up my PowerPoint, I can see the comments here. So if you guys could just type into the chat GTG, which means good to go, that just lets me know that we got a bit of a two-way communication there and that sort of thing. So feel free to just type that into the chat and we'll get started. So today's session is why every brewer should have trust issues with their measurements. Very strange topic, but it's one that every brewer deals with along the way and is super important. Just to give you a little bit of overview, my name is Hendo. I'm the founder of Rockstar Brewer. I run a coaching and mentoring program online for brewers all over the world. I've got clients in South America, the US, New Zealand, Australia, Belgium. It's pretty awesome, and we're having a really good time there. I've been a professional brewer for over a decade. Used to have a brewing company, which spectacularly failed, and I can now take that experience of the things that went wrong, take that to my clients so that they repeat the same mistakes that I made. Brewing's a very tough business, and they have some awesome outcomes there. Was the champion gypsy brewer at the Australian International Beer Awards in 2016. When there's no pandemic, I fly all over the world and judge beer, and used to test shampoo. Quit that now for some reason. If you want to find me online, YouTube and Instagram are basically the best places to find me. Head over to youtube.com/rockstarbrewer. I'm about to release a whole bunch of new content over there for free, which is really cool. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about why every brewer should have trust issues with their measurement equipment. The things that we'll cover today is knowing the problems that can occur if your measurements aren't reliable in the brewery, understanding the principles behind quality measurements, learning the difference between quality control and quality assurance. People bandy around the terms QA and QC all the time, but they're actually two different things. And why it's actually important for a brewer to have healthy trust issues with their measurement equipment. So brewers collect quality data from so many different sources in the brewery, whether it's things like a hydrometer, it's scales, it's the countless thermometers on all of the tanks around your brewery, handheld thermometer, density meters, flow meters, dissolved oxygen meters, spectro, can seam inspection, cameras, all those sorts of things. And this is not even everything, right, that a brewer can use to take measurements. It can present some problems, right? And so let's dive into three of the problems that you're likely to experience. So problem number one is you're brewing blind. And so what do I mean by brewing blind? Well, basically, that means you're taking lots of measurements during the production of a batch of beer. And the problem is you automatically trust every measurement that you take and accept that they're actually all valid and never question it. And when you take measurements, what can happen is if you don't put yourself in a mindset where you don't expect any errors in your measurement or variance in your measurements, and you blindly accept things, then if something actually does go wrong, either with the product or with how you're measuring it, then you're blind to any issues that might happen. It makes it very difficult to make quality decisions in your brewery. The second problem is that invalid data has an impact. Okay, so this is what happens if you blindly accept all of your data. I call it the Geordian data paradox, which basically means you believe that what you're measuring is valid and without error. You log the data as you see it, but it is actually invalid. I'll give you an example of that in a second. When it comes to troubleshooting an issue, it's impossible for anything to make sense. which means that you can't solve quality issues and you can't improve the quality outcomes in your beer. Let me give you an example of how that works. So basically, here's a chart of this is a client that I was dealing with who approached me and said, hey, Hendo, we're having some flavor consistency issues with our beer. Can you help us get to the bottom of what the problem might be? We can't really figure it out. And so luckily, these guys were using Beer 30 and they had a lot of data logged in the system. So this is basically overlay of lots of different batches of the same beer. And this is actually the gravity. So we're starting at about 1046. We can see all the wort original gravities are pretty tight. The finishing gravities are at a pretty tight spread. Could be tightened up a little bit, but wasn't too much. Wasn't too bad. And so that was actually looking pretty good. So then what we did is we flicked over the chart to look at pH instead. This is all the same batches of beer. And as you can see, what happened is that the wort pHs are a much wider spread. So from 5.1 to 5.4, that's a pretty wide spread at knockout. And as we get into beer, the beer pHs were a really, really wide spread as well. And at that time, I was like, there's your problem. And we started working on the problem of solving pH inconsistencies in this brewery. And I found out about 2 weeks later, and we were just having a casual conversation, and I made the mistake of assuming that this brewer was looking after his equipment. And it turns out that they were only calibrating their pH meter once a week. And I have real trust issues with pH meters in a healthy way. And that's really simply not frequent enough to calibrate your pH meter. And I reckon that by the end of a week, that pH meter wouldn't have been giving very accurate, precise readings. And so basically, if you have a look here, we've got like literally hundreds of data points, which because that piece of equipment wasn't being used properly and wasn't being treated properly, all that data in front of us is now worthless and meaningless. And the problem it created there was that we now had to fix the issue with the pH meter and having that calibrated more frequently so they could trust the results. And then we had to go and take all these data points again because we actually didn't know if there actually was a pH issue because none of this data was valid. So that's a major problem. So that leads to problem number 3, which is basically having no plan for if your data is invalid. So what do you do if you come to a situation where you realize that the data might be invalid? How do you ensure that the data remains valid? How do you ensure the continued reliability and repeatability of your measurements? What do you do when things don't seem right or don't make sense? And I'm sure you've all been in that situation before where you've taken a measurement, might be gravity, might be pH, might be alcohol or something like that, where you look at it and you go, that's not right. Maybe it's probably a beer that you make over and over and over again, and you get this unexpected outcome. What do you do to make sure that the data actually is valid and you can go, is there actually something wrong with this beer or is there something wrong with my equipment? It's going to be one of those two things. And I'm sure we've all been in that situation. And so that can lead to quite a lot of frustrations. If the data that you collect is invalid, how can you make the right decisions to create good beer outcomes? How do you know whether the data is valid or invalid? What can you do to ensure that your data stays valid and reliable? And what do you do when things don't look right? And if you don't have a plan around a lot of these things, then it can be a very problematic thing for your brewery. But the thing is that having a healthy skepticism of your measurements will help you make better brewing decisions. It's part of what it means to have quality assurance or a quality assurance program within your brewery. It's complementary to quality control. Kind of the way that I look at it is quality control is the actual taking of measurements in your brewery and checking them against a target. Quality assurance is basically making sure that data that you're generating is valid and remains valid. and that sort of thing. So here's 5 principles that get you started. Oh, this is Lockie and Ev. They're from Ballistic Brewing Company here in Brisbane. They've gone through a pretty massive growth spurt at the moment, and they are having an awesome time and are going through. And usually, it's really around times when a brewery does go through a bit of a growth spurt that a lot of these problems with data validity can sort of rear their head and need to be dealt with, and that's something that Lockie and Ev have had to deal with. So principle number 1, understand that measurement is a science, right? And that you should question every measurement you take. So the science of measurement is called metrology, okay? And measurements can be either exact or an estimate. An example of an exact measurement is basically counting the number of bottles in a case or a number of cans in a case. I look at a case of beer and I can see there's 24 cans of beer in that case. That's an exact measurement. Everything else is an estimate, okay? Whether it's taking gravity reading, weighing out hops with your scales, pH meter reading, dissolved oxygen meter reading, all those sorts of things, that they are not exact. They are all an estimate that the machine has made for you. And the thing that you need to be mindful of is that when you have either exact or estimates in the types of measurements that you're taking, errors can and do occur. And there's 2 types of errors. You get random errors and systematic errors. And we'll talk more about that shortly. And it's good to have a think about, have a look around your brewery and go, which of my measurements are estimates and which are exact? So principle number 2 is understanding what accuracy is, okay? So accuracy is how reliably and how repeatably a measurement is able to be measured to true value. It's not based on a single measurement. Rather, it's based on the average of multiple measurements of the same sample. So if we have a look here, we've got a measurement that we happen to be taking, whatever it happens to be. It's the true value is 20. And if we have a look here, we've got all of these, both of these are actually accurate, even though it doesn't, this one is not accurate and this one is accurate. So this particular reading is quite far away from true value, that therefore it means that it's not accurate. This one here, there's about 25 different measurements being taken. They're all pretty close or around near to true value. So this is an example of something that is a measurement that is accurate. This is the measurement that is not accurate. And that goes complementary to precision. So precision is how close multiple measurements can be taken repeatably and reliably with each other. And again, it's not based on a single measurement. Rather, it's based on multiple measurements of the same sample. So if we have a look here, we've got an example of something that is precise, okay? All of the measurements are very tight in relation to each other, whereas in this bottom chart here, the measurements aren't as tight within each other as they are. It's basically, there's a really big spread there. And this can happen for a lot of reasons. Maybe so sometimes, for example, you might have a thermometer that can only read to 1 decimal place instead of 5 decimal places, for instance. It's a pretty weird example, but go with me here. And the other things that might not be precise is things like scales. If you have something that measures whole kilos or whole pounds, that's not going to be suitable in terms of precision if you're trying to measure out hops to throw in the kettle, if you need something that's less than a pound or a pound and a half or something like that. And so that's what precision basically is. So this is where it gets really weird. So accuracy and precision are not mutually exclusive, okay? You can have a data measurement that is accurate and not precise, not accurate and precise, not accurate and not precise, as well as being being accurate and precise, right? And so accuracy and precision can be influenced by poor trueness, right? So if it's very difficult to work out what the true value of a sample that you're measuring is, then your accuracy and precision can completely go way out the window. So what you need to do is to ensure that each type of measurement you take meets your needs with respect to accuracy and precision. And so what I mean by that is whether it's temperature or volume or specific gravity or pretty alcohol, bitterness, all those sorts of things, you need to work out what your requirements are with regards to accuracy and precision. Let's give you an example of that, right? So this chart, I'll bring up these 4 charts again. So this top left chart, okay, if we've got true value of 20 and we've got 25 samples being measured, this is accurate and precise because the measurements, the data points that are being collected are very tight range to true value, and they're in a tight range to each other, okay? Tight range to true value means accuracy. Tight range to each other is precision, okay? So accurate and precise. This one here is not accurate, but precise. So our measurements are not even close to true value, but they're close to each other. And that means not accurate, but precise. This bottom one on the bottom left, this one is not accurate and not precise because the average value is a long way from the true value, so it's not accurate. And the readings are in a pretty wide spread of each other, so that's not precise. And then finally, we have accurate but not precise, where we have readings where the average lines up with true value, but the readings are a long way from each other. And the average of the readings sort of makes it come out as true value, okay? And that's a really big difference between having something that is accurate and precise to accurate and not precise. It's fascinating stuff. Knowing that these things are not mutually exclusive can be a big game changer with how you take measurements in your brewery. So principle number 5 is have a plan to trust your measurements, right? You have to, if you want to trust your measurements in your brewery, you have to include everything that you measure. And I've given you a couple of examples on an earlier slide. Here's a couple more examples. And these things, for instance, if you don't use these things correctly, they can give you skewed information. The alkalizers can be very, they have to be regularly calibrated and that sort of thing, and they have to be used in a certain way. And so your job as the brewer is to ensure the measurement is as accurate as possible and ensure that the measurement is as precise as required, right? So, for example, you don't want to go overkill. So let's say you're measuring hops to throw into your kettle and you need 563 grams. Well, having a scale that measures whole kilos or whole pounds isn't going to cut it. But then I don't need some sort of really one of those expensive balance scales that measures down to 5 decimal places. It's just really not worthwhile when it comes to measuring out 500 and something grams of hops that's going to go into your kettle. So it's as precise as required. It's your job to keep the measurements valid and to know or to recognize when the measurements may not be valid and to have a plan of rechecking potentially invalid data and making sure that things are working properly in your brewery. A lot of this comes down to dealing with errors in the brewery, right? So whenever we take a measurement in the brewery, we have to assume that errors are going to occur. This is that healthy skepticism, those trust issues. You have to have them. You can't blindly accept them. If you don't assume that errors will occur, then you're just going to think that your brewery is absolutely perfect and that nothing's going wrong, and you're going to wind up in a situation like I did where you can't troubleshoot a problem because you've got literally hundreds of invalid data points, right? And it means by having a healthy skepticism, it means that if you don't have a healthy skepticism, it means that you're not open to all the possibilities when it comes to problem solving a brewing technical issue. So as I said before, there's 2 types of errors. There's random errors and there's systematic errors. Random errors are directional statistical fluctuations, and they can occur due to sampling variations or impurities. Classic one is measuring gravity or pH of a sample, whether it's wort or beer. If you decant a sample from a tank or from your kettle, then that little vessel that you decanted your sample into, did you rinse it with water? And is there water inside there that's going to dilute your sample? Or does it have the last sample in there and they're mixing together, going to give you a random error? That's an example of impurities. Not adhering to SOPs is a very common cause for experiencing random errors. Someone in your brewery thinks they know a better way of doing stuff, but it turns out that they take that measurement in the wrong way, and you wind up with really average data. And also it comes down to machine tolerances. Again, classic example is the scales that can measure lots of decimal points versus none, which is really, really important thing to understand. The other type of errors you're going to get is systematic errors. So systematic errors are usually reproducible and consistent in their direction. And they can occur due to operator error. Again, that might not be following SOPs, or they might not be using it correctly. It could be because of an equipment malfunction. It could be because of maladjustment, or SOPs that are actually invalid. Okay. So, for example, again, let's take a sample that's been tainted with either water or another sample. If you don't have in your SOP to tell the worker or the brewer to go and rinse the sample vessel out prior to taking the sample, then that SOP is invalid, and you're going to wind up with a systematic error. So super important. So how do you deal with random and systematic errors? So random errors don't usually have a direction. They're either higher than or lower than the true value, and you never know which way they're going to go. The way in which you deal with random errors is to take multiple readings and to take an average. So if we have a look at this chart here again, we've got all these random errors that are occurring. We know our true value is something. We don't know what it is, but the average that we're getting is 15. And so by taking multiple measurements, we can take an average and wind up with flattening out that randomness of the errors that you're experiencing and that sort of thing, right? And so it basically means taking the mean, so an average of a series of numbers. So basically, you take the sum of all the readings divided by the number of readings that you took. That'll give you the average. So if we have all these different temperature readings here, for example, and they do vary quite a lot. We're going from 25.9, 26.1, all the way, down to 25.8. It's a pretty tight spread, but is it right for what our purpose is? It's hard to say. But in this particular example, if we add all these up and divide it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we're going to wind up with 26.0375. But this brewery happens to use 3 significant digits, so it becomes 26.0 based on all of those readings there. And that's how you deal with a random error, okay? Dealing with systematic errors. So systematic errors are reproducible and consistent in their direction. They're going to skew one way or the other, higher or lower than the true value. And really common in pH meters and that sort of thing. And how we actually deal with systematic errors is through calibration. So pH meter is a classic example. I always say to my clients, they should calibrate their pH meter every day. And then to ensure that they're actually keeping their pH meter calibrated, that they have a pH meter calibration log sits in the lab, or, where the measuring bench or wherever the measurements are actually taken. So the first person to use the pH meter at the start of the day, their job is to go and calibrate the pH meter and follow an SOP around calibrating the pH meter, of course. And then they write on a log the date, who calibrated it, and things like what the slope of the pH meter was and that sort of thing. And so you can actually track over time. If you collect that data, you can track over time how how the pH meter's calibration is being affected. So taking the slope, which is the calibration between two known standards, you can actually see if your probe, pH meter probe, is starting to become a little bit sketchy. It might need to be serviced, might need to be cleaned, might need to be replaced. That's how you sort of get the idea of how your pH meter is tracking, is through efficient, effective calibration, and you're tracking the calibration as it occurs. So that pretty much sums up today's chat about making sure that you can trust your measurements in the brewery and having healthy trust issues. Learning to measure and trust, it's actually one of the 9, I call, accelerators of the Rockstar Brewer system. So if we have a look right up the top middle here, measure and trust, there are 9 accelerators in the Rockstar Brewer system. These are the things that we work on in the Rockstar Brewer implementation program. Things like minimizing dissolved oxygen, mastering brewing water chemistry, building brewery intelligence, writing beer specifications, or writing beer recipes 2.0. I'm looking for a handful of brewers who want to implement a 9-step craft brewery quality plan over the next 90 days without actually having to spend any money on expensive equipment. If you'd like to know more, just comment trust, leave the comment trust, and I'll reach out to you and I'll get you all the details and that sort of thing. Thanks heaps for, joining me today. If you've got a question, feel free to punch it into the chat. I've just got this here on the other screen here. So if you have a question, feel free to let me know. Just going to have a quick drink of water. I would love to hear from you if you happen to have a question. Today's session is not one of those things that dives really deep into those sort of brewing technical things, but I think if you don't have your eye on the ball with regards to your measurements, trusting those measurements, and all of the aspects of a brewery that goes around the science of metrology, it's impossible to improve your beer and to make your beer better. And so that's why I sort of feel pretty strongly about that. So I hope you guys found that helpful today. Thank you for your presentation. I have no idea how to pronounce your name. Arkadiusz Michaelczuk. Sorry for cannibalizing your name there, but thank you very much for reaching out there. I really appreciate it. If you have a question, feel free to punch it into the chat. I'll give you guys another 60 seconds or so, and that way we'll give everyone a chance, because there's a little bit of a lag here, so it can be very weird and that sort of thing. So let's just see what we've got. Doesn't look like we've got any questions today. There we go. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks very much, guys, for joining me today on this Tuesday chat. Thanks heaps to Andrew and the Craft Beer Professionals Facebook group. It's a lot of fun being part of that group, and I really enjoy that community. It's a nice, healthy community. If you want to know more, head to rockstarbrewer.com, and I've got a free training there. You can go and check that out. And thanks very much for joining us, and have a great day. Cheers.